The year is 1519. The Portuguese Empire dominates the known sea routes to Southeast Asia, controlling the flow of spices, wealth, and influence across continents. But one power in particular refuses to accept this monopoly. Spain, desperate for a western route to the Indies, places its hopes in a man Portugal had cast aside. This is the story of the man who would venture forth into the unknown. The story of Ferdinand Magellan and the crew who would follow him to the edge of the world. Ferdinand Magellan was born into minor Portuguese nobility, but orphaned at the age of 10. Despite this tragedy, his fortunes changed when he was taken in by the household of Queen Leonor, one of the wealthiest monarchs Europe had ever seen. There, he received an education few sailors could dream of. He learned about astronomy, cartography, and navigation, the tools that would define his future. As a young man, he fought in Portugal's naval campaigns in India and Malaysia, helping to secure Portuguese control over the Indian Ocean. There, he employed a personal slave fluent in many languages, known as Enrique de Malacca. Malacca would serve as his interpreter and companion during his future expedition. Returning home, ambitious and hungry for greater renown, Magellan proposed a lucrative venture, a western route to the Spice Islands. Despite his close familial connection to Queen Leonor and her brother King Manuel I, Portugal rejected his proposition multiple times. Insulted and determined to see his goals through to the end, Magellan made a fateful decision. He renounced Portugal and swore loyalty to the Spanish crown.
A new loyalty and departure from Spain. Spain's young monarch Charles I saw opportunity in Magellan's bold plan. He agreed to fund a westward voyage, an expedition that might break Portugal's trade monopoly forever. But the Spanish court was wary. A Portuguese captain leading a Spanish armada? To them, this idea was unprecedented. To settle this outrage, they placed a check on Magellan's authority. Juan de Cartagena, a politically connected Spaniard with no sailing experience, appointed as Magellan's Inspector General and, informally, his overseer. With this, the stage was set for conflict long before the fleet ever touched the sea. On September 20th, 1519, the Armada de Mallorca set sail from Sanlúcar de Barrameda. 5 ships composed the fleet. The Victoria, captained by Spaniard Luis Mendoza. The Concepcion, captained by Spaniard Gaspar de Quesada. The Trinidad flagship, captained by Ferdinand Magellan. The San Antonio, the largest vessel in the fleet, captained by Inspector General Juan de Cartagena. And lastly, the Santiago, the smallest vessel, captained by loyal Portuguese captain João Serrao. Serrao was born in a region contested between Spain and Portugal and was able to gain Spanish nationality like Magellan. About 270 men, the remarkably diverse crew represented nearly every corner of Europe and even parts of North Africa. Among the crew was Duarte Barbosa, Magellan's brother-in-law and close friend of João Serrao. Enrique of Malacca, Magellan's multilingual enslaved interpreter, perhaps the most crucial man in the entire voyage. Álvaro de Mesquita, Magellan's younger cousin with a keen understanding of navigation and respected for his integrity. And Gonzalo de Espinosa, the fleet's Spanish chief constable or sheriff. With the crew assembled, the fleet headed south. Their first stop was the Canary Islands, 6 days out. While resupplying at Monte Rojo, Magellan received a secret message, one that would change everything. The letter came from his father-in-law, Diogo Barbosa. Inside was a warning. Some Spanish crewmen intended to betray Magellan and seized the expedition for themselves by handing him over to anti-Portuguese factions in the Canary Islands. And worse still, the Portuguese crown felt threatened by Magellan's ambition, and a fleet had been dispatched to intercept him and return him to Portugal, dead or alive. Magellan chose to tell no one, but he acted upon this warning. He adjusted course secretly, steering farther down the African coast to evade his pursuers. At midnight on October 3rd, 1519, the Armada officially left Spanish waters for the final time. Crossing the Atlantic and trouble aboard the Trinidad. After following down the African coastline, the fleet finally turned westward into the Atlantic. At first, the ocean was calm, but below deck, tensions were simmering. The Spanish captains and officers were displeased about Magellan's secrecy. Rumours spread that he meant to deliver them to Portuguese Brazil as captives. Despite the suspicion, Magellan's skill as a naval commander was undeniable. Using constellations and lantern signals, he kept all 5 ships tightly in formation. Then came the doldrums, a windless belt along the equator. The fleet stalled amongst the deadly calm of the sea. Days turned into weeks. Oppressive heat suffocated the men. Water soured in its barrels. Superstitions and paranoia spread like infection. At night, many sailors began to fear they would be consumed by enormous sea monsters lurking in the depths. It was in this complete stillness that conflict ignited. In November, Captain Luis Mendoza caught an officer fraternizing with a young crewman aboard the Victoria. With nobody else to turn to, Mendoza reluctantly reported his findings to Magellan for disciplinary action. Magellan convened a fleet-wide trial aboard the Trinidad with all captains in attendance. Ultimately, the officer was found guilty and sentenced to execution upon reaching land. Afterwards, Magellan called a private meeting with his captains in his quarters. He confronted Cartagena directly for refusing to salute the flagship as according to protocol and failing to act accordingly as a captain. Cartagena snapped, insulting Magellan's lineage, authority, and honor. Magellan flew up from his chair, furious, and grabbed Cartagena by his collar. He announced that Cartagena would be arrested on the spot for mutiny. Cartagena begged Mendoza and Quesada to stab Magellan while they still had the chance. Serrao stood with Magellan, declaring that he would share any fate that came upon the commander. With this display, the remaining Spanish captains remained silent, but the seed of rebellion had been sown. Magellan, wary of retaliation from the Spanish court, spared Cartagena's life. He confined him instead, public humiliation in the pillory, then imprisonment aboard the Victoria at the request of Luis Mendoza. To restore balance and prove his impartiality, Magellan appointed a Spaniard loyal to the crown as the new captain to the San Antonio, Antonio de Coca. By the time winds returned, Magellan's authority had been tested and embrittled, but he remained in steady command of the fleet for the time being. Descent into South America and Patagonia. On November 29, 1519, the fleet reached the coast of Brazil near Cape St. Augustine. Despite crew pleas, Magellan refused to land until they found a suitable port. Winds and currents made the passage down the South American continent miserable over the next 2 weeks. Days later, he replaced Coca on the San Antonio with his cousin, Alvaro de Mesquita, a more experienced navigator. This move deeply angered his Spanish officers. At last, on December 13th, they reached the natural port of Rio de Janeiro. Heavy rain greeted them, a coincidence the locals saw as a divine blessing since they had been in a drought for the previous months. After disembarking, the condemned officer from the Victoria was executed. The fleet rested, repaired its ships, traded with locals, and resupplied. The lush city was a much-needed break for the crew after such hardship. On December 27th, they departed, heading deeper south in search of the fabled Strait of El Paso that would lead to the Pacific. On one occasion, the Armada landed at the Rio de la Plata at the entrance of modern-day Buenos Aires and spent 5 days waiting for the Santiago to return from scouting ahead. Despite their diligently combing the coast, each promising inlet proved to be a river. By early 1520, winter storms battered the fleet. Conditions worsened as they pushed toward the far southern latitudes. Finally, on March 31st, 1520, the Armada anchored in a cold, desolate natural bay. They named this outpost Puerto San Julián. With supplies dwindling and the southern winter closing in, Magellan announced a grim order. They would spend the winter here for months. Morale collapsed instantly. To many captains, this was madness. They urged returning north, or even turning for home was the best course of action. Magellan refused. In the growing darkness, the embers of rebellion attracted snakes, and resentment hardened into conspiracy. The Easter Mutiny. Using the disembarking process as a distraction, Luis Mendoza, Gaspar de Quesada, and the imprisoned Juan de Cartagena met in secret aboard the Concepcion that night, the eve of Easter Sunday. Their goals were clear: seize the San Antonio, arrest and execute Magellan, sail home under new leadership. One thing to understand is that Magellan was always aware of the thoughts of his crew due to the charisma and multilingual nature of Enrique de Malacca. The Spanish captains knew that Magellan was hyper-vigilant to their disloyalty, so they turned to underhanded tactics. On the night of Easter Sunday, when violence was strictly forbidden, Cartagena and Quesada boarded the San Antonio with 30 armed men under heavy fog. They captured Captain Álvaro de Mesquita in his sleep, and when the quartermaster, Juan de Elorriaga, tried to raise the alarm, Quesada stabbed him to death. Any loyalists were arrested or killed if they tried to resist. Immediately, the San Antonio, the largest ship in the fleet, was in rebel hands. The mutineers directed their cannons upon the Trinidad. However, the cannons stayed quiet that night. With control over the majority of the Armada and the mighty San Antonio, the Spaniards expected Magellan to negotiate for surrender. Unfortunately for them, Magellan would respond not with negotiations, but with a surgical, deadly counter-offensive. Before sunrise, fate delivered Magellan an opportunity. A boat of mutineers, caught by the current, drifted toward the Trinidad. He seized them, extracted their plans, and acted instantly. Understanding the situation, he sent word to Captain Serrao, instructing him to maneuver the Santiago in the path of the mutineers' escape. Rather than acting passively like the opposition expected, Magellan was setting up for a daring offense. First target, the Victoria. Magellan disguised loyal Marines in the mutineers' clothing and sent them with his alguacil, Gonzalo de Espinosa, claiming to bring a private letter for Mendoza. Expecting surrender, Mendoza allowed the men aboard. As the Spanish captain reached for the letter, Espinosa drew a hidden dagger and stabbed Mendoza through the throat, killing him instantly. The Marines immediately brandished their weapons, overwhelming the rebels. With most of the crew being of non-Spanish descent, they accepted Magellan's brother-in-law, Duarte Barbosa, as the new captain. The Victoria fell to Magellan, and Mendoza's head was displayed to demoralize the remaining mutineers. Unsated, Magellan analysed the positioning of the ships and tides carefully as he planned his next move. A single covert marine was sent from the Trinidad to sever the anchor of the San Antonio. The drifting ship swung into perfect range. Cartagena looked on in fear as his gaze met the revenant of the Trinidad. Magellan stared down Cartagena across the water with anger in his expression. A single flash illuminated the night as the cannonball struck the San Antonio's hull. Soldiers began pouring out of the Trinidad into longboats and approaching the damaged vessel. Unable to retaliate, Cartagena fled to the rebels' last stronghold, the Concepcion. With their ship crippled and surrounded, the San Antonio's rebels surrendered. Cartagena had reached the Concepcion, but it was too late. Magellan was already coming. Under darkness, loyalists stormed the final ship with grappling hooks and ladders. The Concepcion and the mutiny as a whole collapsed in minutes. By dawn, the rebellion was over and the mutineers captured. Aftermath and preparation. For 5 days, the mutineers faced trial, presided over by Mesquita. Over 40 men found themselves in chains. Most were spared in exchange for completing the grueling repair work over the next few months. Magellan showed no mercy to the ringleaders, however. On April 7, 1520, Quesada was sentenced to execution by beheading from his own squire. Cartagena was forced to watch as Quesada and Mendoza's corpses were drawn and quartered, remaining displayed on the beach as a warning. Their remains would stay in San Julian on display until discovered by Sir Francis Drake 58 years later. Cartagena suffered the cruelest punishment. He was marooned with a Spanish priest on a barren island, left to die in pain and in silence. As winter winds howled through Puerto San Julian, the Armada, weathered, shaken, and united by uncertainty, prepared for the journey ahead. After the chaos, new captains were assigned to the San Antonio and Victoria, with the Concepcion remaining captainless for a short time. These voyages had survived storms, starvation, and mutiny, and still maintained the willpower to push forward. As the sun rose once more upon the Armada de Mallorca in San Julian, they prepared themselves for the Odyssey yet to come. Unfortunately, their greatest tribulations were looming over the endless horizon.